Please make sure to subscribe our channel and press the bell icon to get notified about our future videos. To the questions. Question 1. Hotspot. You have an Azure virtual desktop deployment. Many users have iOS devices that have the remote desktop mobile app installed. You need to ensure that the users can connect to the feed URL by using email discovery instead of entering the feed URL manually. How should you configure the _MSR ADC DNS record? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. To the answer area, record type. The correct answer is TXT. To the next statement, record value. The correct option is https://rdweb.wvd.microsoft.com/API/arm/feed discovery. Question 2. Hotspot. You plan to deploy Azure Virtual Desktop. Users have the devices shown in the following table. From which device types can the users connect to Azure Virtual Desktop resources by using the Remote Desktop Client app and the Remote Desktop Web Client? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. To the answer area, Remote Desktop Client app. The correct options are tablet, phone, and laptop. To the next statement, Remote Desktop Web Client. The correct option is tablet and laptop only. Question 3. Your company has a main office and 2 branch offices. Each office connects directly to the internet. The router in each branch office is configured as an endpoint for the following VPNs. A VPN connection to the main office, a site-to-site VPN to Azure. The routers in each branch office have the quality of service rules shown in the following table. Users in the branch office report slow responses and connection errors when they attempt to connect to Azure Virtual Desktop resources. You need to modify the QoS rules on the branch office routers to improve Azure Virtual Desktop performance. For which rule should you increase the bandwidth allocation? The correct option is B, Rule 3. Issues with connection would be related to the initial traffic over HTTPS, not infrastructure in Azure. For the comments related to QoS requires short path, to me, that article reads that the type of QoS that requires short path is within AVD, not router-based QoS, which would be completely separate from AVD. Picking Rule 3 because no indication RDP, short path or private endpoint, so traffic will go to public AVD URL via HTTPS. Question 4. You are designing an Azure virtual desktop deployment. You identify the network latency between the locations where users reside and the planned deployment. What should you use to identify the best Azure region to deploy the host pool? The correct option is Azure Virtual Desktop Experience Estimator. Azure Virtual Desktop Experience Estimator estimate the connection round trip time from your current location through the Azure Virtual Desktop Service to each Azure region in which you can deploy virtual machines. Question 5. You have an Azure Virtual Desktop host pool named Pool 1 in the East US region. You have a storage account named Storage 1 that contains FS Logix profile containers in the East US region. you have a shared image gallery named SIG1 that contains a virtual machine image named Image1. Image1 is used to create new session hosts in pool 1. You plan to deploy a new Azure virtual desktop host pool named pool 2 to the South India region. You need to implement a session host deployment solution for pool 2 that meets the following requirements. Image 1 must replicate in the South India region. The session hosts in pool 2 must be based on Image 1. Changes to Image 1 must be available in the South India and East US region. What should you include in the solution? The correct option is C. From SIG1, update the replication for the latest image version of Image 1. One example is to always replicate the latest image in multi-regions while all older versions are only available in one region. This can help save on storage costs for image versions. Question 6. Your company has 60,000 users. You plan to deploy Azure Virtual Desktop. You need to recommend a storage solution for the FSLogix profile containers. The solution must provide the highest possible IOPS and the lowest latency desktop experience. What should you recommend? The correct option is B. Azure NetApp files. Run your most demanding Linux and Windows file workloads in Azure. Running performance-intensive and latency-sensitive file workloads in the cloud can be hard. Azure NetApp files makes it easy for enterprise line of business and storage professionals to migrate and run complex file-based applications with no code change. Azure NetApp files is widely used as the underlying shared file storage service in various scenarios. These include migration of PO6 compliant Linux and Windows applications, SAP HANA databases, high performance compute infrastructure and apps, and enterprise web applications. Question 7. Your company has a single office and has 40 employees. You are planning an Azure virtual desktop deployment. The estimated user workloads are shown in the following table. Half the users of each workload type work from home. All the users who work from home do not establish a VPN connection to the office. Approximately how much bandwidth is needed between the office and Azure to support the planned workloads? The correct option is B. 55 Mbps. Question 8. Your network contains an on-premises Active Directory domain that syncs to an Azure AD tenant. The domain contains the domain controllers shown in the following table. The DNS servers are configured to forward requests to an external DNS service. You create a new virtual network named VNET2 that is peered to VNET1 and has gateway transit enabled. You plan to implement an Azure virtual desktop host pool in VNET2. The session hosts will be joined to the Active Directory domain. You need to configure DNS to meet the following requirements. What should you configure? The correct option is A. The DNS settings of VNET2 to use Server 2 and Server 1. In Azure, never configure network settings inside of the VM, always via the VNet or the NIC. Answer is A. You should configure the DNS setting of VNet2 to use Server 2 and Server 1 to meet the requirements. By configuring the DNS settings of VNet2 to use Server 2 and Server 1, the Azure virtual desktop users will be able to resolve on-premises servers and Azure resources. Since VNet2 is paired with VNet1 and has gateway transit enabled, the DNS services in VNet 1 will automatically be available in VNet 2. This will ensure that Azure Virtual Desktop remains operational if a DNS server fails. Configuring the DNS settings at the VNet level will also minimize administrative effort, as you only need to make the change once instead of for each individual virtual machine. Question 9. You have an Azure subscription that contains 500 users. The users are assigned Microsoft 365 E1 licenses. You deploy an Azure virtual desktop solution that contains Windows 10 multi-session hosts and streams a custom remote app named App1. You need to ensure that the users are licensed to stream App1. The solution must minimize costs. Which license should you have? The correct option is D, Windows 10 Enterprise E3. The AppV client must be enabled on any client device on which apps will be run from the AppV server. These will be the Windows 10/11 Enterprise E3 devices. Question 10. You have an Azure virtual desktop deployment that contains an Azure Compute Gallery. The Azure Compute Gallery contains an image definition named definitions. Definitions contain the following image versions: 1.0.0, 1.1.0, and 1.2.0. You need to ensure that when a virtual machine is created from the Azure Compute Gallery, the 1.1.0 image version is used by default. What should you do? The correct option is B. Select Exclude from Latest for image version 1.2.0. Updating resources. Once created, you can make some changes to the gallery resources. These are limited to Azure Compute Gallery, image definition, image version, regional replica count, target regions, exclude from latest, and end of life date. Note, when you specify to use latest when creating a VM, the latest image is chosen based on the highest major version, then minor version, and then patch. Question 11. Hotspot. You have an Azure virtual desktop deployment and two Azure AD groups named Group 1 and Group 2. You create two conditional access policies named Policy 1 and Policy 2. Policy 1 is assigned to Group 1. Policy 2 is assigned to Group 2. Both policies include Azure Virtual Desktop as a cloud app. You need to meet the following requirements. The users in Group 1 must be prompted for multi-factor authentication when they connect to Azure Virtual Desktop. The users in Group 2 must re-authenticate every 8 hours while they are connected to Azure Virtual Desktop. Which settings should you configure in Policy 1 and Policy 2? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. To the answer area, Policy 1. The correct option is Access Controls Grant. To the next statement, Policy 2. The correct option is Access Controls Session. Question 12. Hotspot. You plan to deploy two Azure file shares named Share 1 and Share 2 that will be used with Azure Virtual Desktop. Share 1 will contain at least 100 GB of data and must be stored on SSDs. Share 2 must be able to switch between transaction optimized and cold storage tiers and must be stored on HDDs. You need to recommend which type of storage accounts to use for the shares. The solution must minimize costs. What should you recommend for each share? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. To the answer area, share 1. The correct option is premium file shares. To the next statement, share 2. The correct option is standard general purpose V2. Question 13. Drag drop. Your on-premises network contains an Active Directory domain that syncs with an Azure AD tenant. You have an Azure virtual desktop host pool that contains Windows 11 session hosts joined to the domain. You need to configure Azure NetApp files to store user profiles containers. Which 4 actions should you perform in sequence? To answer, move the appropriate actions from the list of actions to the answer area and arrange them in the correct order. Note, more than one order of answer choices is correct. You will receive credit for any of the correct orders you select. The actions provided to us are: create a capacity pool, create a new NFS volume, create a new SMB volume, configure an Active Directory connection to the Azure AD tenant, create a new Azure NetApp files account, configure an Active Directory connection to the on-premises domain. The correct options are: create a new Azure NetApp files account, create a capacity pool, configure an Active Directory connection to the Azure AD tenant, and create a new SMB volume. Question 14. Hotspot. You have an Azure virtual machine named VM1 that runs Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session. You plan to add language packs to VM1 and create a custom image of VM1 for an Azure virtual desktop host pool. You need to ensure that modern apps can use the additional language packs when you deploy session hosts by using the custom image. Which command should you run first? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. To the answer area, blank dash task path inverted comma slash Microsoft slash Windows slash Apex deployment client slash inverted comma close dash task name blank. Here, the answer for the first blank is disable scheduled task. And the answer for the second blank is pre-staged app cleanup. Question 15. You have an Azure virtual desktop host pool named Pool1 that contains the following: a linked workspace named Workspace1, an application group named Default Desktop, a session host named Host1. You need to add a new data disk. What should you modify? The correct option is A. Host1. AVD session hosts are just virtual machines that appear in virtual machines in the Azure portal. Therefore, you manage them in the same way as any other VMs. Question 16. You have an Azure AD tenant named contoso.com and an Azure virtual network named VNet1. To VNet1, you deploy an Azure AD domain services managed domain named litwareincorporation.com. To VNet1, you plan to deploy a Azure virtual desktop host pool named Pool1. You need to ensure that you can deploy Windows 10 Enterprise session hosts to Pool1. What should you do first? The correct option is B. Modify the DNS settings of VNet1. Question 17. You have the devices shown in the following table. You plan to deploy Azure Virtual Desktop for client access to remove virtualized apps. Which device support the remote desktop client? The correct option is B, device 1 and device 3 only. Question 18. Hotspot. You have an Azure virtual desktop deployment. You plan to create the host pools shown in the following table. You need to recommend the virtual machine size for each host pool. The solution must minimize costs. Which size should you recommend for each pool? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. To the answer area, pool 1. The correct option is NV-V3 series. To the next statement, pool 2. The correct option is D, SV4 series. Question 9. You plan to deploy Azure Virtual Desktop to meet the department requirements shown in the following table. You plan to use Azure Virtual Desktop host pools with load balancing and auto-scaling. You need to recommend a host pool design that meets the requirements. The solution must minimize costs. What is the minimum number of host pools you should recommend? The correct option is C3. Question 20. Hotspot. You have an on-premises network. All users have computers that run Windows 10 Pro. You plan to deploy Azure Virtual Desktop to meet the department requirements shown in the following table. You need to recommend licenses for the departments. The solution must minimize costs. Which license should you recommend for each department? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. To the answer area, research. The correct option is Windows Server Remote Desktop Services Client Access License. To the next statement, finance. The correct option is Windows 10 Enterprise E3 licenses. Question 21. Hotspot. You have an Azure subscription that contains a hybrid Azure AD tenant and two domain joined Azure virtual machines. The virtual machines run Windows Server 2019 and contain managed disks. You plan to deploy an Azure virtual desktop host pool that will use a storage spaces direct sale out file server to host user profiles. You need to ensure that the virtual machines can host the storage space direct deployment. The solution must meet the following requirements. What should you do? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. To the answer area, on each virtual machine, install. The correct option is the failover clustering feature. To the next statement, create. The correct option is two shared disks. Question 22. You have the Azure virtual desktop deployment shown in the following table. You plan to deploy a new host pool as shown in the following table. You need to ensure that you can deploy the host pool. What should you do? The correct option is C. Submit a support request for service and subscription limits. Question 23. Drag drop. You have an Azure virtual desktop deployment. You plan to create the host pools shown in the following table. You need to recommend the virtual machine size for each host pool. to meet the session host requirements. The virtual machine size provided to us are A series, B series, E series, F series, and N series. To the answer area, host pool 1. The correct option is F series. To the next statement, host pool 2. The correct option is E series. To the next statement, host pool 3. The correct option is N series. Question 24. You deploy an Azure virtual desktop host pool named pool 1. You have an Azure storage account named store1 that stores FSLogix profile containers in a share named profiles. You need to configure the path to the storage containers for the session hosts. Which path should you use? The correct option is C store1.file.core.windows.net/profiles. Question 25. Hotspot. You have an Azure virtual desktop host pool that has a max session limit of 15. Disconnected sessions are signed out immediately. The session hosts for the host pool are shown in the following exhibit. Use the drop-down menus to select the answer choice that completes each statement based on the information presented in the graphic. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. To the answer area, the host pool type is dash. The correct option is pooled. To the next statement, new sessions can occur on dash only. The correct options are WVD0, WVD1, and WVD6. Question 26. You plan to deploy Azure Virtual Desktop Session host virtual machines based on a pre-configured master image. The master image will be stored in a shared image gallery. You create a virtual machine named image1 to use as the master image. You install applications and apply configuration changes to image1. You need to ensure that the new session host virtual machines created based on image1 have unique names and security identifiers. What should you do on image1 before you add the image to the shared image gallery? The correct option is B. Add a command prompt. Run the Sysprep command. Question 27. You have a shared image gallery that contains the Windows 10 images shown in the following table. You create an Azure virtual desktop deployment that has the following settings: host pool name, pool1, location West US, host pool type, personal. Which images can you use for the session hosts? The correct option is E, image 1 and image 3 only. Question 28. Drag drop. You plan to deploy Azure Virtual Desktop. You need to create Azure NetApp file storage to store FSLogix profiles. Which 4 actions should you perform in sequence after you register the NetApp resource provider? To answer, move the appropriate actions from the list of actions to the answer area and arrange them in the correct order. Note, more than one order of answer choices is correct. You will receive credit for any of the correct orders you select. Select and place. The actions provided to us are: create a NetApp account, create and assign a managed identity, create a volume, create a capacity pool, create an Azure file share, configure an Active Directory connection. To the answer area, the correct options are create a NetApp account, create a capacity pool, configure an Active Directory connection, and finally, create a volume. Question 29. You have an Azure virtual desktop host pool. The pool contains session hosts that run Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session. You connect to a remote desktop session on pool 1 and discover an issue with the frequency of screen updates. You need to identify whether the issue related to insufficient server, network, or client resources. The solution must minimize how long it takes to identify the resource type. What should you do? The correct option is D. From within the current session, use Performance Monitor to display the values of all remote FX graphics slash frame skipped slash second counters. Question 30. Drag drop. You have an Azure virtual desktop host pool named pool 1. You need to ensure that you can create an Azure NetApp files volume that will host user profiles for pool 1. Which 4 actions should you perform in sequence? To answer, move the appropriate actions from the list of actions to the answer area and arrange them in the correct order. Note, more than one order of answers choices is correct. You will receive credit for any of the correct orders you select. The actions provided to us are register the NetApp resource provider, create an Azure NetApp files account, create an Azure file sync storage sync service, register for Azure NetApp files, create a capacity pool, create a file share. The correct options are register the NetApp resource provider, create an Azure NetApp files account, create a capacity pool, create a file share. Question 31. You have an Azure AD tenant named contoso.com. You use a user account named admin1 to deploy an Azure AD domain services managed domain named addcontoso.com to a virtual network named VNET1. You plan to deploy an Azure virtual desktop host pool named pool1 to VNET1. You need to ensure that you can use the admin1 user account to deploy Windows 10 Enterprise session hosts to pool1. What should you do first? The correct option is A. Add admin1 to the Azure AD DC administrators group of contoso.com. Question 32. You have an Azure virtual desktop host pool named pool1. You need to recommend a storage solution for storing the fslogix profile containers for pool1. The solution must provide geo redundancy and minimize management overhead. What should you include in the recommendation? Select only one answer. The correct option is B. Azure Files. Azure Files supports all redundancy options and constitutes a managed solution. Azure NetApp Files does not support geo redundancy. Storage Space Direct is a self-managed solution. Azure Data Share does not support Azure Virtual Desktop. Question 33. You have an Azure virtual desktop infrastructure. You plan to implement fslogix profile containers that will use an SMB file share. You need to identify which registry settings are required to configure the profile container configuration. Which two registry settings are required? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Select all answers that apply. The correct options are C and D, that is enabled and VHD locations. To enable FS logix profile containers, you need to configure at least two registry settings, enabled and VHD locations. The enabled settings turns on the FS logix profile container. The VHD location settings specifies the network path where the profile containers are stored. The other options are not required, but they are optional settings that can be configured for an FS logix profile container. Question 34. You have an Azure virtual desktop infrastructure that uses FS logix profile containers. You need to exclude the contacts, links, and music folders from a user's FS logix profile containers. Which file should you configure to? Specify the exclusions. Select only one answer. The correct option is D, redirections.xml. To exclude files or folders within a user's profile container, you need to create a file named redirections.xml. This file defines what to copy or exclude from a user's profile containers. The XML file is processed during a user sign in and sign out of a virtual machine. Question 35. You have an Azure virtual desktop infrastructure that uses FS logix profile containers. You need to enable the containers to use Cloud Cache. Which registry path should you modify? Select only one answer. The correct option is A, hklm/software/fslogix/profiles. Question 36. You have an Azure virtual desktop infrastructure. Users connect to the infrastructure by using a combination of the following remote desktop clients. You need to configure redirection for devices that only support all three types of clients. Which two devices should you redirect? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Select all answers that apply. The correct options are A and B, that is camera and clipboard. The camera and clipboard can be redirected for all three client types. USB port, scanner, and location are only supported by the Azure Virtual Desktop Store app for Windows client. Note, the questions from 37 to 40 are a part of a series of multiple questions that present the same scenarios. Each question in the series contains a unique solution that might meet the stated goals. Some question sets might have more than one correct solution, while others might not have a correct solution. After you answer a question in this section, you will not be able to return to it. As a result, these questions will not appear in the review screen. Question 37. You have an Azure virtual desktop host pool that contains 5 session hosts. The session hosts run Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session. You need to prevent users from accessing the internet from Azure virtual desktop sessions. The session hosts must be allowed to access all the required Microsoft services. Solution: you configure the RDP properties of the host pool. Does this meet the goal? The correct option is B, no. Question 38. You have an Azure virtual desktop host pool that contains 5 session hosts. The session hosts run Windows 10 Enterprise. You need to prevent users from accessing the internet from Azure virtual desktop sessions. The session hosts must be allowed to access all the required Microsoft services. Solution: you configure rules in the network security group linked to the subnet of the session hosts. Does this meet the goal? The correct option is A, yes. Question 39. You have an Azure virtual desktop host pool that contains 5 session controls, 5 session hosts. The session hosts run Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session. You need to prevent users from accessing the internet from Azure virtual desktop sessions. The session hosts must be allowed to access all the required Microsoft services. Solution. You configure the address space settings of the virtual network that contains the session hosts. Does this meet the goal? The correct answer is B, no. Question 40. You have an Azure virtual desktop host pool that contains 5 session hosts. The session hosts run Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session. You need to prevent users from accessing the internet from Azure virtual desktop sessions. The session hosts must be allowed to access all the required Microsoft services. Solution. You modify the IP configuration of each session host. Does this meet the goal? The correct option is B, no.